be Scott Pitoniak. I think he's probably familiar to most of you. He's been a long-time Rochester sports writer. Proud to have been a good friend of his and teammate in vintage baseball for the last 15 years. And he's going to be speaking to us today about the longest game in baseball history.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. Thanks everybody for coming. You know, a lot of these things here, I know from doing book signings and talks, we often root for bad weather, so we get good turnouts. But this is a nice turnout. We really appreciate you taking time from your day. I've been fascinated with this for a long time. This longest game. You know, I've in 44 years of sports writing, I've been blessed really to cover a lot of memorable events. You know, I was there in 1993 when Joe Carter hit his walk-off home run. Jim Mandolero and I were sitting in the auxiliary press box, which was in left field, and the ball literally landed about 50 feet from us in the Blue Jays bullpen there, and we knew immediately, you know, the historic significance of that, and that it was only the second time in the history of baseball that a World Series had ended with a walk-off home run there inside Toronto's Sky Dome occurred. I was also there earlier that same year when Frank Reich engineered the greatest comeback in National Football League history as the Buffalo Bills came back from a 32-point deficit in the second half to defeat the Houston Oilers at then Rich Stadium. And I was there when Pearl Washington sank a half-court shot at the buzzer to give Syracuse University a victory against Boston College in the Carrier Dome back in 1984. But when I look back in retrospect, the most memorable and bizarre game I've ever written about is this 33-inning marathon between the Red Wings and the Pawtucket Red Sox in the spring and summer of 1981. Now, I wasn't there for the beginning or the end, of the game, but from scores of interviews that I've done through the years and stories I've written about, and interviews with players and fans and managers and announcers who were there, I really do feel as if I were there. And I think that's one of the great things that I love about historical research is that you become so immersed in a subject or a person or an event that you feel as if that you were in some way a part of it. And I think again that's one of the beauties and one of the things I really love about history. I realize we have time constraints here, so bear with me because I'm going to attempt to condense baseball's version of War and Peace into less than 20 minutes here. For the record, and I'm also technologically challenged here, so let me just see if this. How we move this here? Okay, Brian.
Just click the button.
All right. Brian, I'm having some problems.
Just press the left click.
Which one here? Yep. There we go. Okay. Thank you. For the record, the game began on April 18th, 1981, concluded 65 days later, took a total of 8 hours and 25 minutes to complete, which when you think about it isn't too bad given the sloth-like pace of today's games. I mean, I hate to extrapolate like how long it would really take in today's time. It would have been a lot longer than 8 hours and 25 minutes. As I mentioned, it lasted 33 innings. So when you think about it, that's almost a quadruple header. And it would be the equivalent of a 10 overtime game in football or basketball, to give it some perspective. You had 14 pitchers combined to throw more than 1,000 pitches. They also combined to strike out 60 batters, and they teamed up for 29 scoreless innings. So obviously, the hitters had a rough several days here during this game. Steve Grilli, who wasn't even in the Baltimore Orioles organization when this game began in April, he was in the Toronto Blue Jays organization, wound up being the losing pitcher in this game. But he missed the first 32 innings. Batters combined for just 39 hits and 219 at-bats. So that's a paltry 178 batting average. Of the 41 players who played in the game, 25 went on to play in the big leagues. And of course, the most notable, you see their photographs here, Wade Boggs and Cal Ripken Jr. also went on to be enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Both of them played third base, by the way, during that game. And toward the end of the 32 innings that were played over the first 2 days, there was a pitching change, and Wade Boggs told me that he actually just lay down on the field and put his head on the third base bag as a pillow for some sort of symbolism there. Ripken wound up going 2 for 13. Boggs was 4 for 12. And yes, folks, Cal played all 33 innings, as you would expect, right? I remember talking to Jim Umbarger, who was a relief pitcher I'm going to get into a little bit later about what he did in the game, but he told me that that game prepared Cal for his Ironman streak. He goes, what's a few thousand games in a row when you've played in one that's lasted 33 innings in 65 days? I've spoken to Cal probably about a dozen times about this marathon, and he told me, quote, "It's still the most bizarre and remarkable game I've ever been involved in," which of course is saying an awful lot given, the games during the streak and so forth, and the fact that he played in the World Series. He said 33 innings in one game. Now there's a record I don't think will ever be broken. The players and the 1,700 fans who showed up at McCoy Stadium in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, that dank New England night, actually received an omen before the game started that this was not just going to be some ordinary night at the ballpark. The first pitch was actually delayed by about half an hour because there were a bank of lights that were out in right field. And so they had to wait for the maintenance crew to get those lights operating efficiently again. McCoy had a reputation for being a hitter's park. It was a bandbox, a phone booth. But it just so happened that this was one of those nights when the wind was really blowing fiercely in. And so just like we've seen with Wrigley Field, if the wind's blowing out, look out. The wind's blowing in, and it can be a pitcher's delight. So there were a number of balls that night, and I also should say that early morning, that looked like they were going to be hit out. There was a big power hitter for Pawtucket by the name of Sam Bowen, and I remember that Cal Ripken Jr. was telling me that he thought for sure this game was going to be over. He forgets what inning it was, if it was in the teens or even the early 20s, like Bowen just hit a bomb and looked at it was out, and Ripken was actually starting to walk off the field. It hits that imaginary wind wall, and the outfielder catches the ball, and so they played on and on and on after that. Ripken also recalled it being a real, quote, a real chilly night. So the pitchers had a clear advantage. It was so cold, in fact, that as the game dragged on, we actually started fires in the waste barrels in the dugout to keep warm. We gathered up debris and even put some broken bats in the fire. The way the guys were hitting, we could have thrown all the bats into the barrels. It wouldn't have mattered. Bob Drew, who doubled as the Red Wings general manager and their play-by-play announcer on the road, called the 32 innings that were played on April 18th and 19th, and also later, when play resumed, he had been fired as the Red Wings general manager, and he was the color guy with the Orioles, doing it for Armed Services Radio across the world and so forth. But he obviously has some very vivid memories of that game, and he said he kept warm by imbibing cup after cup after cup of hot coffee. And he said that would have been fine, but there was just one problem. There was no bathroom in the press box, and there wasn't enough time to race downstairs to the restrooms. So he said by the time we got into the mid-20s, innings, not degrees, because it started getting real cold there, my bladder was ready to explode. Paw Sox reliever Luis Aponte's wife wasn't at the game, but she also was ready to explode that night from anger. Her husband had struck out 9 of the 14 batters he faced while pitching the 7th through 10th innings. And at 2 a.m., he was given permission to go home because he obviously couldn't go back into the game. And so his wife didn't exactly greet him with open arms when he arrived back at their apartment. In fact, she said, "Where have you been?" And he said, "At the ballpark." Again, this is 2:30, 2:15 in the morning. And she said, "Like hell you have. You're lying." He reportedly spent what was left of the night or that morning on the couch. The first 32 innings of the game dragged on until 4:07 in the morning, and the reason that happened was that the umpiring crew, it was a new umpiring crew, and they had misinterpreted the new curfew rules that had been put in place that year. The officials, officials from both the Wings and the Paw Sox there had approached the umpires like, "Hey, here's the new rule and so forth," and they weren't buying it. And so the general manager of the Red Sox kept calling and finally gets a hold of George Sisler Jr., who is the International League president, and he's located in Columbus, Ohio at the time. And so he's picking up the phone at 3:45 or whatever in the morning and thinking like, this is some prank call here or whatever, when they're telling him like, "Hey, the game's still going on in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. What do you want us to do?" And when he finally realizes it's not a prank call, he goes, "There's no way that they should have gone on beyond 1 o'clock in the morning." And he said, tell the umpiring crew that, once this inning is over, the 32nd inning, that you are to call the game immediately. And so that's what they did. By that time, and again, this was a real miserable night, by that time there were only 19 fans remaining in the ballpark. And the Paw Sox management thought that a good reward for them would be to give them season passes for the rest of the season. Now, I kind of equate this to, like Halloween here, and the kid has been gorging themselves sick, over the candy, and here you're going to give them some more candy or whatever. So at this point, I'm thinking like, you might have given them something in addition to the pass, because I think they had quite enough baseball to that point. This is the scorecard, the actual handwritten one by the official score that's on display in the Hall of Fame. Any of you have scored games, and you know that when you start to get into those extra innings, it creates a lot of problems for you. As it drags on, and you're trying to draw lines down, and you're running out of room, put names beneath it and so forth. So I think it's only fitting that such a bizarre game would have arguably the most bizarre scorecard in baseball history, and that it also would have the most interesting and bizarre box score in baseball history. And there's some real interesting things that we can dissect here as well. But as I said, at the Hall of Fame, they have among the different artifacts, they have the scorecard there. That is the official one. I mentioned that Cale played every inning, and then he went 2 for 14 in the game. He joked to me that a bunch of us had a bad week that game. And what they were really worried about, Cale wound up getting a base hit when the game resumed 65 days later in the top of the 33rd. And he was kind of happy about that, because otherwise he's going to be looking at a 1 for 14 game. And the thing was that they all knew that once this game was over with, now those averages would become official. So there were going to be some people who were going to really take a tumble just from this one game when these stats became official in June. But as bad as Cale's day was, it was nowhere near as bad as Dallas Williams. Dallas Williams, I believe, still holds the stolen base record. I could be wrong on that, but I think single season, Gary.
Yes.
But he wound up going 0 for 13 in this game. which is the worst batting line in the history of organized baseball and stuff. So, and I remember talking to him, and he said, "Yeah," he goes, I didn't want to look at my average after that. Like, it was just gonna. I think he said he lost like about 10 to 15 points in his batting average on the basis of one game that took effect. To me, the most amazing feat, though, was not that Cal played 33 innings. To me, it was Dave Huppert, the Wings catcher, who wound up catching 31 innings before Doc Edwards, the manager, mercifully took him out. And there's an interesting sidelight to this. The next day, they were scheduled to play another game against Pawtucket, and they made the decision, we're not going to finish this game. We're just going to play the one game. But who knows how long that game's going to go, and then you're going to play another game. Well, Huppert obviously was not scheduled to catch the next day, but the backup catcher winds up getting hurt during warm-ups, and so Huppert has to catch 9 more innings the next day. He told me that between the 31 and the 9 innings that he caught those 2 days, that took like a year off his career, he said. All the squatting up and down, up and down, up and down. By the time he was done here on a cold, damp night, he just said he could barely move. And he joked to me at one point. He turns around, he said this might have been in the late 20s as far as the innings were concerned. He turns around to the home plate umpire and said, "Will you please call 16 straight balls so we can end this thing and get some sleep?" The umpire didn't buy it, but nonetheless, that's what he was looking for. Meanwhile, Jim Umbarger, also an Iron Man, gave new meaning to the term long relief in this game. He took the mound in the 22nd inning, wound up striking out 9, allowing 4 hits and no runs in 10 innings. And he told me he felt like he could have gone another 6 or 7 innings because he was so amped up from drinking coffee for the first 22 innings. He said he was just so over-caffeinated, he was ready to go. As I mentioned, even though the teams had a game scheduled that day, later that day, they decided, now we're gonna make this up when Rochester makes its next trip into Pawtucket, which wasn't until June 23rd. The atmosphere for the resumption of this game was electric. You had a packed house, 5,700 fans at McCoy Stadium, as well as the national and international media. You had television crews from Japan, the BBC. There were 140 media credentials issued, and that was about 138 more than were issued for the first Wings Paw Sox game. And part of this had to do not only with the uniqueness of this game, but also the fact that Major League Baseball was on strike. So you had many national media who were starving for baseball coverage, and so you had all these columnists from major newspapers come to town to chronicle this incredible game. And sadly, you get there, it's big build-up and everything, and the game lasts, the last inning lasts 18 minutes. And Grilly, as I mentioned, he was not in the Orioles organization the first time around, so he's chosen by Edwards to start the bottom of the 33rd, and it didn't go well for the veteran hurler. He plunks the leadoff hitter, Marty Barrett, with his first pitch, surrenders a single to Chico Walker, and then decide the strategy is going to be, we're going to walk Russ Larrabee to load the bases and get the force situation going. And at that point, Edwards brings in Cliff Speck, and Cliff Speck winds up yielding a single to Dave Koza, shown here, and then Marty Barrett shown being greeted by Wade Boggs at the plate here, with the winning run in this game. And so as this, the roar of the crowd's going, this game's over with and stuff, and they had played at that same time as he's scoring the run, Is That All There Is by Peggy Lee. You could barely hear it above the crowd. And it did, everyone I talked to was disappointed that it ended so quickly. From Cal on, they said well, what the heck now? This is a resumption of this. Let's play for as long as we can. Let's put this record so far out of reach here. Let's play 40 innings or whatever. But it didn't happen. There's as I mentioned, there's the scorecard is in the Baseball Hall of Fame, along with a tape of Drew's marathon broadcast. He's, again, the only broadcaster who did every single inning. And there were people here in Rochester who were still listening at 4 in the morning. And Koza's bat's there, and a couple of other artifacts as well on display. Like I said, I didn't cover it, but this is one of those games, like I feel like I was there just from all the people that I spoke to, all that I've read, all the research I've done. And, it's one that people ask me, like, if you could go back and cover a game or whatever, certainly this would be near the top of my list. If you're interested in learning more about it, there's a great book out that came out a couple of years ago by Dan Barry, New York Times. It's a fabulous book called Bottom of the 33rd. And Jim Mandolaro and I, if I can make a shameless plug, we also devoted an entire chapter to this game back when we wrote Silver Seasons, and then we updated it, Silver Seasons in a New Frontier. So, but it's, again, I continue to be fascinated. Every time I run into one of these guys, whether it's Cal or even Wade Boggs when I was covering him before the Hall of Fame and stuff, when I brought that up, like, their eyes light up because they just love talking about this. It's just such an unusual game. And with that, I'll leave it open for questions. Anybody have any questions?
Is that Steve Grilly's son, who's a current patron?
Yeah, it is. Jason Grilly. Steve Grilly wound up settling in Syracuse, and Jason Grilly was, like, I believe, the 4th overall pick by the San Francisco Giants way back when. He went to Baldwinsville High School, and I think he pitched at Seton Hall, if I'm not mistaken. And so it's kind of cool because I'm Facebook friends with both of the Grillies, and it was a really cool thing for now. Like, Jason is with the Toronto Blue Jays and stuff, and so, like, for Steve to be able to go back to kind of his old team and kind of sharing this with his son was kind of one of those cool father and son moments this past season. Sean.
The minor league teams don't always carry a full bench or bullpen. I presume at some point these two teams ran out of players, didn't they?
Yeah, they didn't. And that's why I think when you look back at it, it's why they pitched. Umber. Why would you pitch a guy long relief 10 innings? Yeah. I mean, that was and some of these other guys went long too. There were some substitutions made. Again, to me, the most remarkable thing is you're always worried about in these games like All-Star games, you're always worried about your catchers, right? You have enough catchers. Because you can always throw a position player. And I suppose today, if you had a game like this, I would think more than likely you're going to throw a position player. You're not going to pitch anybody, even if he's not truly a prospect or more of a suspect or whatever. You're not going to pitch him 10 innings, I don't think.
So by the time they got back together, then I presume the rosters were much different. How did they figure out who was eligible to play?
Well, yeah, you couldn't, like, guys that you had taken out of that original game, you couldn't play again. So Hufford could not go back in. He probably wanted to even at that point. One of the interesting things is Umbarger was quite upset. And some of the guys were a little upset with Doc Edwards and that he's going to start Steve Grilly. And instead of, Umbarger, hey, I'll keep pitching, like, just think about that. I could have, a performance where I pitched 17 innings in relief or whatever, And Grilly, in talking to Grilly, he was in tears because he felt he really let this team down. He knew the magnitude that this was a historic game and so forth. And but there were some players who were upset, like, that Doc Edwards would go ahead, like, well, this guy wasn't even on our team back then, Nothing really against him, but, again, you could have thrown Umbarger out there and so forth. But they did have the new acquisitions you could plug in and so forth. But there weren't, position-wise, well, what did they say? There are 41 players who wound up being used in the game. So I'm sure they had the reinforcements there for the 33rd.
You mentioned the 140 credentials were issued for the 18-minute rezoning, right? So, could you talk about, like, how the story built in the media? Because I'm sure the next morning someone had to write that story. Probably didn't get in the paper that day, right?
Oh no. I mean, back then, I'm trying to think of my newspaper days. We had we could hold, like, the big thing was Monday Night Football, we would have to try to hold for the final edition, and you would try to catch as many, they would replate the presses, and you would try to catch as many as you could. No, there's no way. What they did was they ran like, like it finished, too late for our deadlines or whatever.
Right.
And even then, like, people had no idea that this thing was still going on at 4 o'clock in the morning. I mean, I've heard from people say, like, they were working different shifts and stuff, and they're going to work and they're flipping, and all of a sudden this baseball game's on, and they're thinking, like, is this just like a replay or something? No, this game's actually going on,
Right.
And but the media buildup was, it was enormous, and I think a lot of it had to do was, again, because Major League Baseball was on strike, and it was a fairly long strike, and so again, major metropolitan columnists or whatever, they're looking for things to write about. And they go like, wow, this is kind of cool and different, so we're going to go there. And as I said, like the BBC sent a crew, and you had a Japanese television crew there. There was talk that the novelist Philip Roth was there, and stuff. So there was just it was the buildup was incredible. And I tried to think of this, like when Hideki Irabu came here. I think that may have been the most credentials that the Red Wings have ever issued for a home game, and most of that was the traveling Japanese media that followed him as kind of like the White House press corps.
Right.
I mean, it was amazing. Like we had gone down to Binghamton before he came up here to pitch against the Red Wings, and I believe it was somewhere around that number of close to 140, 150 credentials. But yeah, there was a tremendous build-up leading up, and then it was just kind of disappointing. I mean, it was in, on the Today Show, the next Good Morning America, and so forth the next day. But people were hoping for a lot more. That last inning didn't live up to the hype, I guess. All right. Thanks so much.
All right, so we're at the halfway point, so we'll take our 7th inning stretch here. We'll break for about 10 minutes and then reconvene right at 4 o'clock, basically. We have some water and cookies on the table in the back. Feel free to help yourself. If you haven't been getting emails from me, there's a paper back there for name and email address. Please sign up, and it will get you included. There's also some information on the back table about the Rochester Baseball Historical Society and how you can sign up for it, and also some postcards from SABR and how you can sign up for SABR if you're interested. So, thanks for coming, and we'll be back in 10 minutes.